Day my son-in-law stood in our kitchen and told me I had no legal right to be in my own grandchildren's lives. I looked at my daughter across the table and waited for her to say something. She looked at her hands. That silence told me everything I needed to know. And it was the beginning of the worst 2 years of my life. I'm 64 years old. I live in a small bungalow in Kitchener, Ontario, 3 blocks from where my daughter grew up. I planted the rose bushes out front the spring after my husband passed. I volunteer Tuesday mornings at the food bank on Weber Street. I know my neighbors by name, and I bring soup when they're sick. I am not a dramatic woman. I have never in my life caused a scene. But what happened to me? What was done to me quietly, over months, in the name of family? I spent too long thinking I deserved it. So let me start at the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what came before. My daughter was 31 when she met him. She'd been focused on her career for years. She was a physiotherapist at a clinic in Waterloo, and I'd stopped worrying about whether she'd find someone. She was happy on her own. She had her friends, her apartment, her cat. Then she met him at a colleague's housewarming party, and everything shifted. He was charming in that particular way that can look like confidence until you know what to look for. He had an answer for everything. He had opinions about wine and investment portfolios, and the best way to drive from Toronto to Montreal in under 5 hours. My daughter laughed more around him than I'd heard her laugh in years, and I told myself that was enough. They were together for 2 years before the wedding. She called me the night after he proposed, crying happy tears on the phone. I cried too. Her father had been gone 4 years by then, and I felt his absence in that moment like a physical thing, a hollow behind my sternum. But I told her he would have loved this. I believe that was true. The wedding was in September, at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was beautiful. I wore a pale blue dress I'd bought at a boutique in Guelph, and I danced with my son-in-law during the Mother of the Bride song, and I thought, this is fine. This is going to be fine. His family was from money. Old Ontario money, the kind that comes with a family cottage on Georgian Bay and a preference for not discussing what any of it cost. His mother was pleasant in a clipped, managed way, like someone who had been taught warmth as a skill rather than inheriting it. His father shook my hand at the reception and complimented my dress, and then spent the rest of the evening talking to the vineyard owner. I didn't take it personally. The trouble started small, the way it always does. After the wedding, my daughter and I had always spoken on the phone every Sunday. It was our habit. She'd call while she was making dinner, and we'd talk for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her week, my garden, what we were each reading. About 4 months into the marriage, the calls started getting shorter. 15 minutes, then 10. Then sometimes she'd text instead. Sorry, Mom. Busy week. Talk soon. I told myself it was the adjustment of a new marriage. I told myself I was being clingy. My daughter was 33 years old, and she had a husband and a full life. She didn't need to talk to her mother every Sunday like a teenager, checking in. Then she got pregnant. I was over the moon. I drove up to their house in Oakville that Saturday with a little bag of things. A soft yellow blanket I'd knitted, a card, a bottle of sparkling juice. My son-in-law answered the door and seemed surprised to see me, though my daughter and I had spoken the day before, and she'd said to come by. He called upstairs and she came down with that specific expression she used to get as a child when she was caught between two loyalties. I recognized it immediately and felt a small, cold thing settle in my chest. We had a nice enough visit, but when I left, my son-in-law walked me to my car and said, very casually, that my daughter needed rest and that they were trying to keep things calm during the pregnancy. He said it with a smile. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I drove back to Kitchener, telling myself he was just protective. New father instincts, all that. Over the next 7 months, I saw my daughter 4 times. She called me when she went into labor, and I drove to McMaster in Hamilton, and I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. He came out and told me she was resting and that only immediate family was in the room. I said I was immediate family. He said he meant his parents, who were already there. I sat in that waiting room for another hour before a nurse took pity on me and brought me to the room herself. My daughter looked exhausted and beautiful, and she reached for my hand the moment she saw me. My grandson was asleep in the plastic bassinet beside her bed. My son-in-law was in the chair on the other side, watching me cross the room with an expression I couldn't read. His mother was on the small sofa near the window, and she gave me a smile that didn't move her eyes. I held my grandson for 12 minutes. I know because I counted. Then my son-in-law said the baby needed to sleep and it was better to limit handling in the early hours. I handed him back. My daughter said nothing. I thought about my husband on the drive home. I thought about how different this would have felt if he were in the seat beside me. The following months were a study in erosion. Not anything dramatic enough to point at and say, look, here is the problem. Just small things, consistently. Plans that fell through at the last minute. Invitations that arrived too late to make the drive. A birthday party for my grandson's first year that I found out about through a photo on my daughter's social media page, posted 2 days after the event. When I called and said I hadn't known about it, my daughter went quiet and then said she thought I'd known. I hadn't. She apologized. There was something in her voice that sounded like shame, but it wasn't directed at her husband. I didn't push. The Christmas that my grandson turned 18 months, I was invited to their house for dinner. I arrived with presents and a roast chicken I'd spent 2 days brining because I know my daughter loves it. My son-in-law met me at the door and said they'd already eaten. They'd moved dinner to noon because of the baby's schedule, and he'd forgotten to tell me. It was 4 in the afternoon. He said it so simply, like forgetting to mention a schedule change to the grandmother driving 90 minutes was the most ordinary thing. I ate reheated chicken alone at their kitchen table, while my daughter put the baby down, and my son-in-law worked in his office. When she came back down, she sat across from me, and we talked quietly, and for a moment it felt like the old Sunday calls. Then he came into the kitchen for a glass of water, and she straightened up and changed the subject. I drove home in the dark, and I cried on the 401, and I promised myself I would not mention it again. I would not be that mother. The following spring, my daughter told me she was pregnant again. That summer, she stopped calling altogether. I sent texts. Most were read but not answered for days. When she did respond, it was brief. We're fine, just tired, I'll call soon. She never called. I started driving to Oakville once in a while, not to pressure her, just to drop things off. Homemade soup. Books I thought she might like. A little sweater I'd knitted for the baby coming. One afternoon in July, my son-in-law answered the door and told me my daughter wasn't feeling up to visitors. I asked if she was all right. He said she was fine, just needed quiet. I asked him to tell her I loved her. He said he would. He closed the door before I finished my sentence. I stood on that porch for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then I went back to my car. I talked to my son about it that night. He lives in Edmonton. He'd moved west for work years ago. He listened carefully and then said what I was afraid to say myself. Something isn't right. He asked if I thought she was safe. I said I didn't know. The not knowing was the worst part. I called my daughter from my car in her driveway the following week. She picked up. When I told her I was outside, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mum, I need you to respect our boundaries." It was a phrase I recognized, the cadence of it, the specific word choice. I'd heard it from him the previous Christmas. I asked her, quietly, not accusingly, if those were her words or his. She hung up. I sat in that driveway for 20 minutes. Then I drove away. I didn't go back for 2 months. My son flew in from Edmonton in August, and we talked for a whole evening, sitting on my back porch with the windows open, the sounds of the neighborhood coming in around us. He said he'd tried calling his sister several times and gotten brief responses. He was worried in a different way than I was, calmer, more strategic. He said we needed to be careful. If we pushed too hard, we'd be painted as the problem, and we'd lose access entirely. I hated that he was right. The second grandchild arrived in October, a girl. I found out when my daughter sent a group text to family with the name and birth weight and a single photo. I was not there. There was no invitation to be there. I sent flowers to the house. I don't know if they were received. That November, my son-in-law sent me an email. Formal, 4 paragraphs. He said that my daughter found my behavior stressful and that for the sake of her health and the health of their family, they were asking me to limit contact to scheduled visits approved in advance. He said this was not a punishment, it was a boundary. He said they hoped I would understand. I read it 4 times. My hands were shaking by the end. I called a friend, a woman I've known since we were in our 30s, who had been through her own version of a difficult family situation. She listened to the whole story, and then she said something that changed things for me. She said, "You need to write everything down. Every date, every incident, every word you remember. Write it all down now, before more time passes." I bought a notebook, and I spent 3 evenings writing. Dates, details, what was said, who was present. The Christmas dinner I ate alone. The birthday party I wasn't told about. The door closed in my face. The text messages left unanswered. The phone call where my daughter used his words and hung up. By the end of the 3rd evening, I had 36 pages. My son read them on a video call, and his face was very still. He said he thought we needed to talk to someone who understood grandparents' rights. I didn't know that was something you could do. I thought families just navigated these things privately, suffered privately, stayed quiet. I made an appointment with a family lawyer in Kitchener, a woman who had been recommended by a woman at my church. I walked into her office with my notebook in my bag, and I sat across from her and I told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "In Ontario, grandparents can apply for access to grandchildren under the Children's Law Reform Act. It's not automatic. The court looks at the best interests of the child. But what you've described, a pattern of deliberate exclusion, is exactly the kind of situation the law was designed to address." I said I didn't want to take my daughter to court. I said I was afraid of what it would do to our relationship. She said something I'd thought about many times since. She said, "The relationship is already in trouble. The question is whether you do something about it or spend the next 20 years grieving from the outside." I asked her what the first step was. She said, "Document everything," which I was already doing, "and consider mediation before litigation. A family mediator, neutral ground, everyone in a room together." I talked to my son that night. He said he would cover whatever the legal costs were. He said, "Mum, you deserve to know your grandkids." I hadn't cried in weeks. I cried then. I sent my daughter a letter, not an email, a real letter, handwritten on good paper, sent by post. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I missed her, and that I missed her children, and that I was asking, not demanding, for the chance to sit in a room together and talk. I told her I had made an appointment with a mediator, and that I would pay for everything, and that all she had to do was say yes. I waited 3 weeks. The reply came by email from him. He said my daughter did not wish to participate in mediation. He said continuing to contact them was causing harm. He said if I proceeded with legal action, they would be prepared to respond. My lawyer filed the application the following Monday. I won't pretend the months that followed were anything other than brutal. My son-in-law hired a lawyer, and their response painted me as an intrusive, controlling woman who had never respected their family's needs. They submitted screenshots of texts I'd sent, texts that read completely differently, stripped of context. They described the afternoon I sat in the driveway and called my daughter as harassment. I read their legal documents at my kitchen table, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not sadness. Fury. Clean, cold, clarifying fury. My lawyer said to stay steady. She said to let the record speak. We submitted my notebook, dated and detailed. We submitted the group text announcing the birth of my granddaughter, the one where I learned I had a granddaughter. We submitted the email where he told me I was limited to approved scheduled visits, written entirely in his name, with no acknowledgement that my daughter had written a word of it. The court ordered a family assessment. A social worker came and interviewed all of us separately, me, my son-in-law, and finally my daughter. I don't know what my daughter said, but the assessment came back and it noted a concerning pattern of one partner managing and limiting contact with extended family, including the applicant. Those words, a concerning pattern. The day my daughter called me, not him, her, from her own phone, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, I almost didn't recognize her voice at first. She sounded younger than she had in years. She said, "Mum, I'm sorry." We talked for 2 hours. She told me things I won't repeat here because they're hers to carry, but she told me enough for me to understand how slowly it had happened, how each small thing had seemed reasonable on its own, how by the time she understood what was happening, she was already deep inside it and couldn't find the door. She said the social worker's report had cracked something open. She said seeing it written down by an outsider, the pattern of it was different from living inside it. She had spoken to a counselor. She was talking to a lawyer of her own. I asked about the children. She said they missed me. She said my grandson still had the stuffed bear I'd given him at his first birthday and slept with it every night. I held the phone and looked out at my rose bushes and didn't say anything for a moment. My son-in-law moved out of the family home in March. The divorce is ongoing. My daughter and the children are staying in the house in Oakville, at least for now, and I drive out every other Saturday and we cook together and the kids run in the backyard. My granddaughter has learned to say, "Grandma." She says it constantly for everything, like a charm. I'm not going to tell you everything is repaired because it isn't. My daughter and I are careful with each other in ways we never used to be. There are things we're both still figuring out how to say. The trust comes back slowly, the way warmth comes back into your hands after a long time in the cold. But I know my grandchildren's faces. I know my grandson's favorite color, green, very specifically the green of his rain boots. And I know my granddaughter's laugh. I know the weight of her when she falls asleep on my shoulder in the car on the way home from the park. People ask me sometimes if I regret filing, if I wish I'd just waited, stayed quiet, hoped things would change on their own. I think about those 2 years, the Christmas dinner eaten alone, the birthday I found out about through a photograph posted online, the door closed before I finished my sentence, the 36 pages in a notebook. I don't regret it. I regret that it came to that. I regret every circumstance that made it necessary. But I am 64 years old, and I have buried a husband and raised 2 children on a teacher's salary and grown roses in Ontario's short, stubborn summers, and I know what it costs to go quiet when you should have spoken. I spoke, and I am still here. Did this story stay with you? I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments below if you want to help this channel keep bringing you stories like this one. A super thanks means the world to me. 2 more stories are waiting for you on screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I don't want you to miss what's coming next. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, not in the courtroom, but before it. Before the lawyer, before the notebook, before I found the words to say what was happening to me out loud. What I keep coming back to is this: I almost didn't file. I sat with that lawyer's card on my kitchen table for 11 days before I called her. 11 days of telling myself I was overreacting, that I was too old to make waves, that a good mother doesn't drag her family into a legal dispute. That silence, that hesitation, that was the part of me that had been trained over 2 years to doubt my own judgment. And I nearly let it win. The thing about being slowly pushed out of someone's life is that it happens in increments small enough to explain away. A cancelled visit, a late text, a door closed a little too quickly. Each one, taken alone, is nothing. Taken together, over months, they hollow you out. And somewhere in that hollowing, I started to believe the story being told about me, that I was too much, too intrusive, too emotional, that my need to know my grandchildren was somehow unreasonable. It wasn't until I wrote it all down, 36 pages over 3 evenings, that I could see the shape of it clearly. That's what I want to say to anyone who finds themselves where I was. Write it down. Not for the courts, not for anyone else, for yourself. Because when you can see a pattern on paper, you stop being able to pretend it isn't there. That's not a small thing. That's the beginning of knowing what's true. I think about my daughter now, and I don't feel anger. I feel something more like grief, and also something more like respect. Because what she did, finally, took more courage than anything I did. I filed papers from a safe distance. She had to look at her own life clearly from the inside, while she was still living it, and decide she deserved better. That takes a particular kind of strength that I'm not sure I would have had at her age. What saved us, and I do believe we are in the process of being saved, wasn't just the legal process. It was three things that showed up at different points in the story and refused to leave. The first was honesty, the willingness to look clearly at what was happening, even when it was painful, and even when the picture it made was not the one I wanted to see. The second was clear-headedness, not panic, not revenge, but careful, deliberate thinking. The notebook, the lawyer, the mediator, the measured steps. And the third was the refusal to give up. Not stubbornness, something quieter than that. The decision, made fresh each morning, to still be there, to still be reachable, to keep sending the soup and the letters even when they weren't acknowledged, because the alternative was a silence I couldn't live with. My granddaughter says my name now like it's the most natural word in the world. I drove out last Saturday, and she met me at the door in her rain boots, the wrong feet, both of them. And she held her arms up and said it. And I picked her up and stood in my daughter's doorway in the October cold and thought, this is what I almost let them take. I'm 64 years old, and I know, more clearly than I ever have, that the things worth keeping are worth the difficulty of keeping them.